The auditorium lights on the 27th floor burned brighter than usual, washing every corner of Luminartech's headquarters in a synthetic glow. Balloons bobbed against the ceiling, and a half-empty bottle of champagne hissed in someone's careless grip. Screens along the walls flickered with dashboards and live traffic counts, metrics climbing so fast they looked like fireworks. My system, the one I'd written line by line through 1,000 sleepless nights, was alive, and the entire company was buzzing in celebration. I stood near the back, clutching a plastic cup of flat, sparkling water, watching the crowd roar. Marketing snapped selfies with foil balloons shaped like goats. Sales passed out branded cupcakes, and even finance loosened their ties long enough to cheer. It should have felt like triumph, like vindication. Instead, a chill ran down my arms as I saw the slide change on the main projector. The system diagram filled the screen. Every node, every pipeline, every dependency drawn in the careful language of my architecture. At the bottom, where the credit line should have read Lead Engineer Evelina Cross, it said something else. Project Lead Grant Mallory. The crowd clapped louder, turning toward him as he strutted to the front with his $9 haircut and permanent smirk. He held the mic like a rock star, thanking the executives for their vision and his team for execution. My team, my execution, my work. The applause was deafening, bouncing off glass walls that looked out over Midtown. My smile froze, then disappeared entirely. I felt invisible in a room that owed its heartbeat to my code. For a brief second, I imagined standing up, cutting through the noise, shouting the truth until they had no choice but to look at me. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. Instead, I sipped my water, watched the confetti fall, and let the silence harden inside me. Recognition wasn't coming. Not from them. And if they thought they could erase my name that easily, then I already knew what their next step would be. Grant raised his glass in a toast, the crowd echoing his cheer. I turned away before they finished, walking out of the auditorium as if I had somewhere better to be, because I knew I would need every ounce of composure for what came next. I didn't make it back to my desk before Grant intercepted me in the hallway. He had a coffee in one hand and that same easy smirk he wore when someone else had done all the work. "Hey, quick thing," he said, lowering his voice like it was a secret. "Your bonus isn't going through this cycle. Policy restrictions. You get it?" I stared at him, the hum of celebration still echoing behind us. Policy. He waved a hand, already looking past me. "Yeah, upper levels are cracking down on post-launch payouts. Not personal. You understand." Then he gave me a patronizing pat on the shoulder, the kind you give to a dog that stayed quiet during dinner, and walked away. I stood frozen. 2 years of weekends spent babysitting database failures, nights of staring at coffee-stained notebooks, debugging until the sun rose over the East River. All those hours, every line of code that made their dashboards shine, and the reward was a shrug and a smirk. Back at my desk, the inbox was flooded with messages. "Congrats, can you hop on a quick call? Need metrics, ASAP." I answered each one mechanically, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. The system still ran because of me, but in that moment, I understood how little they cared about the person behind the architecture. As the crowd thinned, Mara from QA leaned over the partition. Her voice was low, urgent. "You know this isn't about policy. Right, I overheard HR last week. They've been talking about cutting your bonus for months, said it would make you easier to push out later." The air tightened around me. It wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate. They were laying the groundwork to erase me completely. I nodded once, thanked her quietly, and turned back to my screen. If they wanted me gone, they'd chosen the wrong way to do it. I already had something in place, something they didn't even realize existed. And all it would take was one clause to remind them exactly who they were trying to erase. The memory came back as I sat in the glow of my monitor, answering congratulatory emails like nothing was wrong. 2 years earlier, Luminar Tech had been preparing to cut me out completely. They wanted to outsource the rebuild of our analytics stack to a boutique contractor in Austin, someone who bragged about 10x engineering and didn't believe in documentation. I still remember overhearing the chatter in the hallway, Grant's voice carrying like it always did. She's too protective, too opinionated. Her salary's a cost inefficiency. Those words stung deeper than I admitted. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I reread the vendor draft contracts line by line, determined to find a way to secure my place. That's when Rebecca Hanlon appeared at my desk. She was a junior counsel then, still new, with a stack of casebooks bigger than her frame. She leaned down, lowered her voice, and said, "If they try to erase you, this contract is your only shield. Look for the compliance subsections, they won't bother reading them." We spent 2 weeks locked in back and forth with the vendor's lawyers. They hated the language I proposed, a clause that tied the license validity to the continued, compensated employment of the designated technical lead. In other words, me. If they stopped paying me or tried to edge me out, the entire 80 million platform would lose its legal standing overnight. Grant never noticed. Procurement didn't notice. Leadership signed the deal without a second glance. To them, it was boilerplate. To me, it was a safeguard. A buried landmine no one remembered existed but me. Rebecca and I exchanged a look the day the signatures came through. She said nothing, just tapped her pen against the line number and gave the faintest smile. I tucked the PDF into a folder labeled Final Executed V7, buried on the server like a secret waiting to be unearthed. Now, as I thought of Mara's warning and Grant's smug dismissal, the memory sharpened into certainty. They believed I was replaceable. They had no idea I was the only reason their license still breathed. The next morning, I opened my laptop and saw at the Slack workspace error, "You no longer have access to this channel." At first, I thought it was a glitch. Then I noticed my recurring stand-up invite had disappeared from my calendar. Along with the weekly sprint review, my name wasn't on the attendee list for the product roadmap call either. By mid-morning, it was undeniable. I'd been erased. I walked into the conference room anyway, sat down at the long table, and opened my notebook. Nobody said a word, but the silence felt staged. 10 minutes later, someone coughed awkwardly and pointed out there weren't enough chairs. My chair was rolled to the corner. I took the hint, stood, and left without comment. Back at my desk, I kept my face neutral, hands steady on the keyboard, but inside, the humiliation burned. They weren't just cutting me out of Slack or meetings, they were practicing a kind of professional erasure, one that turned me into a ghost in the system I had built. So I started my own project, a folder on my encrypted drive, labeled with the most boring title I could think of, Insurance. Into it, I dragged everything design drafts, version histories, Slack transcripts, architecture diagrams with timestamp signatures, every log, every artifact that tied me to the spine of Luminar Tech's analytics system. With each file, my anger steadied into something sharper, calmer. They thought they were writing me out. I was simply tightening the record of how deeply my fingerprints ran through the company's veins. By the time the office emptied that evening, my folder had grown into a digital arsenal. I shut my laptop, slid it into my bag, and walked past Grant's glass office. He was laughing on a call, back turned, as though the system would run forever without me. I smiled faintly at the thought. Let him laugh. I already knew what clause waited like a tripwire beneath his feet. By Friday morning, the noise of celebration had faded into the background hum of business as usual. Grant strutted through the office with his Bluetooth earpiece. talking loudly about expansion plans as if the platform would carry itself into eternity. My inbox was still flooded with requests, dashboards, metrics, custom slices for executives who wanted numbers polished for their investor decks. I gave them everything they asked for, without complaint, without delay. Let them keep using the system. Then, when the timing felt right, I opened a blank email, recipient Rebecca Hanlon, legal, subject line FYI, potential issue, body 2 sentences, a polite reference to Appendix D Clause 13.2 attached with the original vendor-signed PDF. Nothing dramatic. No warning shots. Just facts. I click send. The paper airplane icon disappeared, and just like that, the fuse was lit. Hours later, the executive floor began to ripple with unease. I wasn't invited to the meeting, of course, but word travels fast when voices rise behind glass walls. By mid-afternoon, I'd pieced it together from the whispers Rebecca had opened the contract, traced her finger down the page, and read the line aloud. If she's unpaid, we're in breach. The room went silent. Grant tried to laugh it off, called it boilerplate, but Rebecca didn't even blink. She closed the binder gently, the way someone might shut a coffin lid, and asked the question that drained the color from every face at the table. Please tell me you paid her. Silence spread like contagion. Eyes darted to spreadsheets, to HR, to finance. Nobody had the answer they wanted. In that moment, every dashboard glowing across Luminar Tech's empire flickered in their minds, not as proof of success, but as liability. I didn't need to be in the room to feel the panic setting in. The clause had finally surfaced, and the system they worship now balanced on a single truth: my paycheck. It started just after midnight on Sunday, a quiet stutter in the automated reconciliation report that never reached the CFO's inbox. By morning, the cracks had widened into chasms. The investor dashboard refreshed to a crimson banner, license unrecognized. Customer churn models blinked out like dead street lamps. Forecasting projections pulled nothing but static. By the time I arrived at the office, the building buzzed with the low-grade panic of people pretending nothing was wrong. Phones rang without pause. Slack threads that usually hummed with emojis and quick fixes turned into walls of all-caps desperation. Anyone else locked out? Did the vendor pull credentials? Who owns Appendix D? I didn't join the threads. I sat in the break room, poured burnt coffee into a chipped mug that said "Data never sleeps," and watched the chaos ripple outward. Interns scurried between floors carrying printouts that meant nothing. Analysts rebooted routers like medieval doctors bleeding a patient. Marketing tried to draft cheerful investor updates while refreshing screens that stubbornly showed errors. I leaned back in the plastic chair, stretched my legs, and let the bitter coffee burn my tongue. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 years of sacrifice, erased in a single slide, dismissed by a shrug and the word policy. Now the system they had paraded around like a trophy was unraveling because they thought I didn't matter. The building's usual rhythm clattering keyboards, muffled laughter, the hiss of the espresso machine was gone. In its place came whispers, sharp footsteps, and the rising edge in voices that couldn't hide the truth any longer. Their miracle platform had flatlined, and not a single one of them could resuscitate it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any speech. Each passing minute, every unanswered email pulled the rope tighter. When my phone finally buzzed on the table beside me, I already knew who it would be. By the time I left the office, the building felt like a funeral home. Phones still rang, but no one answered. I walked through the gray drizzle of Brooklyn, fed my cat, and poured myself a glass of wine. For the first time in days, the silence belonged to me. At 6:42 p.m., my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. No assistant buffer, no masked ID, just a raw direct dial. I answered with a single word. Yes. A pause. Ragged breathing. Then the voice. The CEO himself, stripped of his polished calm. What will it take? Not hello, not we're sorry. Just gravel and desperation. I sat down at my desk, opened the folder I'd labeled "They're going to beg," and pulled up the prepared PDF. My attorney and I had drafted it weeks earlier, anticipating this exact moment. 3 bullet points. Plain as day. Immediate wire transfer of my unpaid bonus. A 40% breach penalty, payable within 24 hours. A public acknowledgement of my role at the next company-wide all hands. But I'd added one more line before saving the final draft. A legal statement, backdated and notarized, crediting me as the sole architect of Luminar Tech's analytics platform. No vague mentions of teamwork, no diluted phrasing. My name, carved into the record. I heard the click of his keyboard as he opened the attachment. 10 seconds of silence, then a sharp exhale. "You want blood," he muttered. "No." I said evenly, "I want accuracy and payment, both overdue. For once." He didn't argue. The silence stretched until I could almost hear the weight of his pride collapsing. "Finally," he whispered, "you'll have it." I closed the laptop, stroked my cat's fur, and finished my wine. Outside my window, the city pulsed with indifferent lights. Inside, I knew the next battle wasn't about money. It would be about survival in that glass-walled boardroom. The next morning, I didn't bother showing up to the office. I didn't need to. My name had already made it inside the one room that mattered. Rebecca had called an emergency session in the executive boardroom. Through whispers and Slack leaks, I pieced the scene together, the CEO seated at the head of the glass table, flanked by HR, finance, and Grant, who still believed bluster might carry him through. Rebecca began without theatrics. "Every dashboard you've shown investors in the past 72 hours is inadmissible. Every projection, every churn report, every forecast pulled from that platform fraudulent, because the license is invalid if Ms. Cross is unpaid." Silence. Then Grant leaned forward with that oily confidence he wore like a cheap suit. It's boilerplate. Vendors put those clauses in all the time. Nothing enforceable. Rebecca didn't raise her voice. She simply turned her laptop toward them. A vendor email glowing on the screen. Compliance confirmed clause enforcement. No grace period. License void. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The CEO's face drained. He glanced at the printout in front of him, then back at Rebecca. Who even wrote that clause? Rebecca looked at him, then at Grant. Before answering, she did. Grant's jaw tightened. The CEO leaned back, the weight of realization pressing into his expression. I could almost picture it, his empire, balanced on the one person they'd tried to erase. Rebecca closed her laptop, her voice precise. "Surgical. Fix this today. Wire the full amount. Penalty included. Issue the acknowledgement, or we notify investors and the vendor simultaneously. For once." Nobody argued. Even Grant stayed quiet, his bravado shrinking in the heavy silence. And while they sat in that glass cage choking on panic, I was in my Brooklyn apartment, watering a plant on the windowsill, already knowing what their decision would be. By the end of the day, the wire confirmation landed in my inbox. The number glowed across the screen. Bonus. Breach penalty. Every cent accounted for. A second email followed. Minutes later, an official draft statement from legal. At the top, in stark lettering, it read, "Acknowledgement of Sol System Architect Evelina Cross." I scrolled through each line slowly, absorbing it the way you savor a moment you always knew would come. They had finally put my name in black and white, where it could never be erased. The same executives who'd toasted without me were now bound to speak my name in front of the entire company. Friday's all hands would be the first time most of them realized who had kept their empire alive. I leaned back, letting the glow of the city outside my Brooklyn window fill the room. This should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like a ledger balanced, the cold arithmetic of justice. They had surrendered because they had no other choice. Then a new ping broke through. Different domain. Subject line opportunity at Horizon Systems. I opened it, scanning quickly, then slower. Horizon had tracked Luminar Tech's launch from the outside. They recognized the signature of my work in the code, but instead of trying to hire me as an employee, their offer was something else entirely. Partnership, equity, a chance to shape strategy, not just execute it. For a long moment, I sat still. The two emails side by side. One represented the overdue respect wrung out of a company that never wanted to give it. The other was a door to something larger, cleaner, free of the chains I'd just broken. I thought of Rebecca, of the way she had quietly helped me write the clause years ago. I thought of Mara's whispered warning that HR had planned to edge me out. And I thought of the countless nights hunched over a terminal, fighting for recognition that never came. Now it was here twice over, from power begging and from freedom knocking. I closed my laptop softly, already knowing which path I'd take when morning came. By Thursday morning, I drafted the shortest update of my career, one line, posted on LinkedIn before I finished my first cup of coffee, independent data compliance consultant. I hit publish and set the phone down. Within minutes, the notifications began. By the first hour, my inbox was flooded venture firms, fintech startups, healthcare giants, each offering meetings, contracts, introductions. The market had seen Luminar Tech stumble, and they wanted the woman who held the blueprint in her hands. But it wasn't the flood of offers that made me pause. It was one message buried in the chaos, signed with a name I knew well, Rebecca Hanlon. Her note was simple. They'll keep patching holes until the ship sinks. Why not build a vessel of our own? That afternoon, we met at a cafe in Brooklyn, a narrow corner shop with cracked tiles and tables too close together. The kind of place where no one cared if you stayed for hours with nothing but 2 coffees between you. Rebecca spread a legal pad across the table, already filled with notes, and I pulled up my laptop. Between us sat the first outlines of something new, a boutique compliance tech firm, lean, sharp, untethered from the arrogance that had drowned Luminar Tech. We worked through scenarios, drafted names, laughed quietly at the absurdity of it all. Uptown, executives were still scrambling to spin their disaster into unexpected vendor downtime. Down here, we were mapping something real, something that belonged to us. When the cafe grew loud with evening chatter, Rebecca leaned back and studied me over her empty cup. They'll hate us for this. I smiled. They already do. We packed up as the rain began again, the city buzzing outside with the kind of restless energy I hadn't felt in years. For once, I didn't feel tethered to the mistakes of someone else's empire. I wasn't surviving in silence anymore. I was shaping what came next. As I walked out into the damp Brooklyn night, I thought about the journey that brought me here, the erasure, the stolen bonus, the claws buried like a landmine, the silence that forced them to finally see me. They mistook that silence for weakness. They thought it meant surrender. But silence was never my prison. Silence was the blueprint of my escape.